It is 2:15, so we welcome back Laurie for part 3 of Zimmun, I believe. Part 3 and the final part of our fascinating discussion on women and Zimmun. Vakasha.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be back. So happy to see you back here. Get started another week. I want to share with you, before we start looking into sources, something, a little kind of fun project that I run a website called Deracha.org, which is really an educational initiative about this area of mitzvot. Deracha is co-sponsoring with Torah in Motion this series. And we did this kind of fun project this year. I'm going to show it to you if I can get my screen share working the way I want it to work. Okay, let's see, that was step 1, which I hope was successful. That was step 2. Yes, okay, here we go. So here we have something we kind of created this year. We printed them out. We called them Zimmun cards. So what is a Zimmun card? Apropos of what we were discussing last time about women making Zimmun and the strong halachic basis for women to be making Zimmun and the hesitation that we often see for women to do it. Talking to a lot of people, we found that one of the big barriers to women's making Zimmun is not really knowing what to say. Our first topic tonight is going to be talking about the text in Zimmun. So what we did is we printed out little insert cards for people to put into their benchers. This was sponsored, it's actually nice. This was sponsored by 2 bat mitzvah girls who are twins, and they're the oldest in their family. So their bat mitzvah meant that they suddenly had the occasion to make Zimmun very frequently. So they took some of their bat mitzvah money to sponsor a print run of the Zimmun card. And the Zimmun card, the idea of the Zimmun card is that, and we also made a PDF version so people could have on their phones. The idea is just that it shouldn't be that the reason someone's not reciting, the reason women are not reciting Zimmun is because they don't know what to do or say. That's the idea of the card. We made a version with transliterations. We made a Sephardi version in line with what we saw last time, that the Ben Ish Chai was very supportive of women reciting Zimmun. And sometimes there's a misconception that anytime women might want to participate in something ritually, that's only in the Ashkenazi world and not in the Sephardi world. And this is a nice example where there's very clear Sephardi psak in favor of the practice. So we made this little card. Actually, one of the nice a punchline that we had last week, I got a message from a friend of mine who works at the National Library of Israel, and it may be that our Zimmun cards will be joining their Birkon collection in terms of the modern Israel collection in the National Library. And the truth of the matter is, honestly, they should, because it represents something, and it's interesting to think about why this doesn't exist necessarily in your standard bencher. And it's interesting to think about how much of our ritual life is shaped by simply what's in print and what's to hand. So let's talk about the text a little bit. The text of Zimmun is actually more flexible than one might think, and that's maybe the one drawback of these Zimmun cards that we made, is that they might make people not realize how much flexibility there is. So let's talk about the basic text of Zimmun. The core text of Zimmun already shows up in Rambam. It's pretty short. The Omer, Rambam's discussing Zimmun here. The Omer, Nevarech Shalchanu Mishalo. So the Mizam, the person leading Zimmun, says, let us bless the one from whose food we ate. The Kolonin, and everyone responds, Baruch Shalchanu Mishalo Tuvo Chayinu. Blessed is the one from whose food we ate, and through whose goodness that we live. And then he says, Baruch Shachan Mishlav Tvocha. The Mizamin repeats that line, and then he says, Birkat Hamazon. That's it. That's the core text of Zimmun. So it's kind of funny, actually, that we get into the discussions that we get into about women reciting Zimmun and what text women would say when the core text of Zimmun is, in fact, so brief and actually not gender specific at all, right? Nevarech just means let us bless, and that works for men and it works for women, and that's the essential text. What's going on? Well, a couple things are going on. First of all, we have this Gemara in Pesachim that kind of introduces the idea that maybe something else is going to get said before benching, and this Gemara in Pesachim should sound familiar to those of you who have heard of Sephardi Zimmun, because it's very similar text, right? Amrulei Havlan v'Nivrich. They said to him, this is the story in the Talmud is of students who are eating at someone's house, and they say, give it to us, or give us, or let it be, v'nivrach, and we will recite a blessing. By give us, where they're referring to in the context is pretty clear. They're asking for a cup of wine, because one of the ways in Judaism that we indicate that a ritual is significant is by establishing the ritual over a glass of wine, right? That's if you think about it, Borei Pregafen shows up an awful lot in different rituals where it's not obvious that it should show up. It's at the wedding, right? It's in Kiddush, it's in Havdalah, it's here in terms of benching, and the reason why why the wine's there is to lend chashivut, importance to the atmosphere. So they would say something to get the cup from Birkat Hamazon. There's a passage from the Zohar, which I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because I'm going to be honest, I don't fully understand it, even though I can translate it. There's a passage from the Zohar which suggests effectively that for a bracha to really take effect, there should be some kind of an invitation. Now, Zimmun itself is an invitation. And so they wanted to kind of like add an invitation to the invitation. There's this impetus for the bracha to have full force, that there should be more and more preliminaries to it. So that's what the Zohar says. And Magen Avraham kind of picks this up. So as he says, Katuv b'Zohar, Reish Parshas Dvarim, Sheyomer Havlam b'Nivrach. It's written in the Zohar at the beginning of Dvarim that you say this line that we saw in the Gemara. Give it to us, let us, and bless. Because any matter of sanctity requires some kind of invitation or convocation. He says that's why in Yiddish we say Rabosai mir villen benchen. We say gentlemen, let us bless, because that's a preliminary invitation in the spirit of the Zohar to get our bracha in force. And they respond with this pasuk from Tehillim. The pasuk from Tehillim is, by the way, I'll just say parenthetically, it's a little interesting that we say it because it includes the name of God, and we're going to see that there's a big halachic distinction between a Zimmun that includes the name of God in the sense of Nevarech Elokeinu Shalchal Mishalo versus one that doesn't. And it's kind of interesting that Ashkenazi Zimmun plugs in a pasuk with the name of God actually fully said, irrespective of the occasion. But of course, the rules for saying God's name in the context of a pasuk are a little different from the rules of saying God's name in any other context. So that's how that can kind of work out. What's also kind of interesting is it's sort of clear from the Gemara and from the Zohar that the context of Havlam v'Nivrach really fits best over a glass of wine. And effectively, we've ditched the glass of wine. And that's not really what we refer to anymore. So we have our language of Zimmun that we're more familiar with in Ashkenaz, it's Rabotai Nivarech, right, is the common way that it's said. And the Kolba says, why do we say Rabotai Nivarech? Miderech HaMusar, L'chol mi shivarech she'itol reshut min hagdolim ha'mesumin kan. It's mussar, it's nice, it's the way it's good manners, it's the way to behave. You ask for permission. This is a really important explanation because effectively what we've seen then is the core text of Zimmun really starts with Nevarech. The preliminaries are considered to add to the level of bracha in a mystical way, but they're really fundamentally preliminaries. And the nature of the preliminaries is on some level being polite, being proper. That's why the language also of Rabotai. Rabotai is sort of like gentlemen, my fine sirs. It's not just collegial address. It's a very flowery form of address, and it's not really specifically addressed to the person that you're eating with, right? The father might say Rabotai Nevarech even if he's eating with his two teenage sons. They're not exactly in a concrete sense in his life rarefied fine gentlemen in contrast to the father. And yet that's the way you say it. That's what's done. It's flowery and it's very polite and it's very ceremonial and it's an addition. The Sephardim get much closer to what we saw in the Gemara. And the thing that they emphasize is that we're asking God's assent. In other words, we're asking for this idea of we're blessed to the highest sanctified God, and then the response is Shamayim. And that response, Shamayim, is basically saying we're asking permission of heaven to say Birkat HaMazon. So rather than heaping flowery praise on those eating with us, we're focusing our praise on God, and on Shabbos that expands to, saying things like with the permission of the Shabbos queen. This is all relevant because on the one hand, one of the biggest barriers to women reciting Zimmun is not necessarily knowing what they should say. And on the other hand, what we've just seen is on a technical halachic level, it's not clear how much it matters. Rabotai, for example, with the flowery language, really in theory could refer to men as well as women. It's not, it is a gendered term in a technical sense, but we're not really, again, we're not talking about the person next to us being the lord of the manor. We're just saying, my fine sirs. It's a more abstract ceremonial form of being polite. Rav Hengen tries to deal with this issue, and he says that this is an interesting question. Can you include men in it? We're going to be talking about mixed zimun later. He's talking about women are making a zimun for themselves. This is his case, the case that we've already dealt with. Women are making zimun for themselves. And the question is, the man is there. Now, what we learned previously was Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein said the man there can respond, and even that it's preferable for him to respond. We saw also there were some other views, like Rav David Cohen of Flatbush was not in favor. He thought it was a negative feminist innovation, certainly for the men to respond. But Rav Hengen is asking a kind of basic question. Well, what do you say? So like the man is there. He's not really joining your Zimmun exactly, but he may be responding to your Zimmun. How do you open up your Zimmun? So he writes like this. If the women making Zimmun can include men somehow in what they say. And they could say maybe gvirotai v'rabotai. This is very, this is what you say like in modern Israeli Hebrew, this is, ladies and gentlemen. Again, that's really the spirit of the thing, right? The spirit of the thing is not rabotai in the sense of these are rabbanim sitting in front of me. It's I'm being an official master of ceremonies. This is a convocation. Nevarech, obershut gvirotai v'rabotai nevarech, shalchan mishalo v'chayotze ba'ela. Eineni roek peda mitzadadin. So Rav Hengen says, you know what? I don't think there's a problem. Even if, from his perspective, even if the men are sitting there and they're not technically joining the women's zimun, for the women to say rabotai, azma, technically it's okay. Even so, he doesn't think it's preferable. Mikol makom. And I'm sorry, I should add, I think he's also comfortable with that with for men. I don't think he'd have a problem with a man saying to a group, remember the women are obligated actually to be a part when there's a group of 3 men or more who are eating to join into their zimun. I don't think he has a problem necessarily with them saying gvirotai v'rabotai in that case either. But he says like this, Mikol makom im sadu gimel nashim misha chad u'shnayim. Adif sham is a menet tomar gvirotai nevarech, chavrotai nevarech. Chavrotai nevarech probably really comes from the kibbutz, where chavirai nevarech, everyone is a comrade in the kibbutz originally. So that's probably the first place where chavrotai came from. The nice idea of chavrotai, which means kind of like my colleagues or my fellow women, the nice thing about it is the root of chavrotai, chet bet reish, is the same as the root of the word chavura. Now remember when we started talking about Zimmun, we talked about the concept of the chavura, of the eating fellowship. So there's something nice about referring again to the eating fellowship before Birkat HaMazon. But in any case, basically what Rav Hengen is saying, look, technically, you can be very flexible about what you say. I probably have a preference, he says, if there are men around that you say gvirotai or chavrotai. The reason he gives is because he wants it to be really crystal clear that the women making the zimun are not making the zimun for the men. Even if the men are responding to praise God, the men are not joining the zimun. Okay, so that's the first. That's the first point. And just bringing up, I don't want to dwell too long on it, but this has been more controversial than what I think it should be from my presentation so far. Like Raakov Ariel, for example, and this was highlighted very strongly in an article by Rav Joel Walsky in tradition. Rav Yaakov Ariel wrote a series of online responses to someone who wanted to recognize his mother in Zimmun. He wanted to say, Birshut Ba'alat Habayit. 3 men are saying Zimmun, the mother's at the table. He wants to say Birshut Ba'alat Habayit. And Rav Yaakov Ariel says no. And the reason he says no is that this is choreget mina mikubal. It's going outside of what's accepted. V'yesh la pirtza lo mutzedeket. And this is like an unjustified breach. Hanovak nir'eh mimavakim chevratiyim shemakomam b'makom acher. Ach b'shum af panim ve'ofen lo miskeret zo sheberkan mazon. This is a part of a feminist struggle to recognize your mother, and it doesn't belong there. He's effectively taking the position that this birshut is really now a fixed part of ritual, and playing with it in any way is no longer appropriate. Interestingly, Shlomo Aviner, who can be very strict about this kind of thing, is much more flexible. He says, nah, it's an addition. You can be flexible. You can do different things. So where does this leave us? Actually heard, we had someone write an interesting letter to us under Achel when we publicized the Shir, the Zimmun cards, who said, well, my rabbis say that if a man is sitting at a table with a woman, like a male guest, and there's a couple, and he wants to recognize the Ba'alat Habayit, he has to say, Birshut Baal Habayit, Ubichavod Ba'alat Habayit. So meaning with permission of the Baal Habayit and in honor of the Ba'alat Habayit. And what that position is basically doing is it's saying that this Birshut is a formal halachic asking of permission to lead Zimmun, and therefore there's no flexibility, and you can only use the word of Reshut with someone who would be leading Zimmun, but you can give anyone you want honor, which is it's actually a really nice attempt to be able to balance traditionalism with making room for recognizing, let's say, the hostess at the table. At the same time, it's not really crystal clear how that idea developed, just in terms of the fact, again, that the core text of Zimmun really starts with Nevarech, and the Rabotai is really, if you look in earlier sources, it's really related to more as a formalistic, polite act, and that especially seems to be the case in Sephardi Zimmun, where again you can be asking Reshut from the Shabbos queen. So it's kind of an interesting, tricky thing about how reluctant, back to the importance of printed text and the influence of printed text, how even things that in theory might be flexible, how reluctant we are, and sometimes rightly so, how reluctant we are to play with something that's been put in print. Okay, I want to get into the 2 core issues I want to talk about with the time that we have left tonight. The first test is what we call mixed Zimmun. Mixed Zimmun meaning can a man and 2 women, or a woman and 2 men combine to form a Zimmun. Okay, that's the first thing I want to talk about. And the second thing I want to talk about, which is related but not identical, is Zimmun b'Shem. All right, when that Zimmun has the language of Nevarech Elokeinu Shacham Mishalom. So let's start with mixed Zimmun, which starts off really with the Mishnah. Now the truth is the Mishnah's language is not crystal clear, but it's very consistently explained in one way. So the Mishnah's language is Nashim v'avadim uktanim ein mezamnin alehem. Women, bondsmen, and minors, we don't recite Zimmun over them. That's literally what it means. What this has been taken to mean, and here I bring Piskei Rid, is just one of many examples. What this has been taken to mean almost across the board is Afal Gav Ditnan, even though we learn in the chapter called Mishametu and Brachot, Dinashim v'avadim chayavim b'birkat hamazon, even though we learn that women are obligated to recite Birkat hamazon, afilu achi, lo chashivi litzterufi im anashim lezimun. Even so, they're not counted to combine with men to create a zimun. So the way they're reading it is, nashim v'avadim uktanim, these 3 groups, ein mezamnin alehen, you can't kind of together with them or in addition to them create a zimun. Okay, now again, what we're going to have to be dealing with is the question of how this is different from the cases we've seen, right? We saw that men can make a Zimmun and women can have an obligation to participate in that Zimmun. We've also seen that when we're talking about a Chavura, an eating fellowship, that one person can make Hamotzi for the entire group, where the entire group very frequently includes both men and women. And that's a chavura. And we know the laws of chavura are often very much similar. So something we're going to have to try to understand is why the case of what I call a mixed zimun, men and women combining to form a zimun, where there wouldn't be a quorum among the men alone or among the women alone otherwise, why that's more problematic. Before I get there, I should note that there is a dissenting view about how to understand the Mishnah. The dissenting view is recorded. It's not like a recent dissenting view. This is a dissenting view that goes back to 10th century Ashkenaz, Rav Yehuda Cohen. And what he does is he reads the Mishnah as follows. He reads it as women and badsmen and minors, nashim vavadim uktanim, ein mezamnin alehen. Wait, let me try to get this. I have to remember how he's reading it. Sorry, I'm going blank for a second. Wait. I think he was reading it as for that there's a problem with a mixed group of them, but not necessarily with men reciting Zimmun just with women. I might be getting that wrong. The truth is, it's somewhat speculative exactly how he was reading this Mishnah to start with. But look, here's how his opinion is brought in Maram Rottenberg, where we see more the result of reading the Mishnah differently than specifically how he was reading the Mishnah. Rav Yehuda Cohen Amar, he said that women, in fact, could combine with men to create Birkat Hamazon. He brought the following proof. It's an interesting proof. The Gemara in Bracha, remember we started by talking about women's obligation, Birkat Hamazon? And when we did that, we talked about how the Talmud in Brachot in one place raises this question: is women's obligation on a Torah level? Or is it on a rabbinic level? And when it did that, it brought a nafkamina. What was the practical halachic test that they brought for that? Lotziat harabim. The nafkamina was, can the woman discharge others' obligations? Mashma tahapshita lan demitztarfi. Well, if we're asking about women discharging other obligations, then it must have been clear to them that women could join for the Zimmun. If it weren't the case, they should have asked in the Gemara, well, the nafkamina is, can a woman combine with men to make a Zimmun? But since instead they asked, can a woman discharge a man's obligation, which is like a further step than combining, says Rav Yehuda Cohen, well, that means that a woman can combine with men to form a Zimmun. Now, again, he's clearly reading the Mishnah in a non-standard way. It doesn't say explicitly what way that is. I suggested one possibility. Taz suggests a different possibility for what he might have been doing with the Mishnah. Taz wants to say, oh, you know what he thinks the Mishnah is? That you can't have two women and one man, but you could have two men and one woman. Again, he's trying to understand how Rav Yehuda Cohen is reading that Mishnah, because that's not the standard reading of the Mishnah. Okay, so there is this view that is given in the name of Rav Yehuda Cohen from early Ashkenaz, that women and men, in fact, can combine, but it is really not the minority. It's really a minority view. It's a dat yachid, pretty much. It's an individual view for the most part. That's how it's understood. Now, here's Rashi. And Rashi explains why women and men can't combine in his way. Shalosh nashim v'chein shlosha avadim, aval ein shtei nashim o shnei avadim mitztarfin im anashim. But two women or two men can't, or two bondsmen can't join with a man to create a zimun. Lefi sheyesh ba'an nashim ma she'ein benashim uba'avadim, because the men are doing something the women aren't. She'ena nashim omrot brit, because the women don't say brit. You remember this also? See, it wasn't just for fun that we went over some of the laws of Birkat Hamazon. They become relevant. There is a view, we'll recall, that women reciting Birkat HaMazon would not talk about Al Britcha Shechatamta B'Yivsarenu, would not talk about the covenant in our flesh, and would not talk about Al Toratcha Shelimadtanu, would not talk about the Torah that God has taught us. Rashi clearly assumes that women are not saying these things. If women are not saying these things, says Rashi, how could women combine with men to create a Zimmun? One thing to participate, but another thing to create the quorum. Why? Rashi clearly thinks that the people who are part of the quorum all need to be reciting the same text or the same fundamental text of Birkat HaMazon. It's interesting because nowadays we do say Brit. Would Rashi change his view? One could argue that he still wouldn't change his view because women are not saying Brit is a matter of obligation. We're saying it is a matter of custom, and maybe that's not enough. But basically, Rashi is saying different texts mean can't combine to create a Zimmun. That's position number one. Position number two is the Maram. We quoted the Maram quoting Rav Yehuda Cohen, and then Maram disagrees with Rav Yehuda Cohen. So when he disagrees, he shares with us something about what he thinks. Ve'shiv lo Maram. Here's Maram's response to him, Maram Rottenberg. Tomar b'isha she'ena yechola lavo lidei chiyuv doraita le'olam. Would you really say about a woman that she could combine with men to form a Zimmun? Whereas a woman we don't understand as being obligated on a Torah level in Birkat HaMazon, at least not as a matter of certainty. Di'im motzia charinim Birkat HaMazon im kein doraita hi. Because if she were to be able to discharge other obligations clearly, if we definitely viewed women as obligated on a Torah level in Birkat HaMazon, then it would be clear, it would be obvious that she would be able to combine. What's Maram Rottenberg saying? He's saying difference in obligation. If you have different levels of obligation, you can't combine to create Zimmun. All right, so those are two views that are pretty, if you think about it, those two views are pretty technical and they're specific to Zimmun. It makes sense why those views would not get in the way of making a motzi together. Everyone's saying the same text of hamotzi. We all have the same level of obligation in hamotzi. And it makes sense why these views would also not get in the way of a woman being able to participate in a men's Zimmun because she's not creating it. Having a different level of obligation in Zimmun doesn't mean that you can't participate in it, but it might get in the way of creating it. So that's like a technical perspective on this issue. Now there's a different perspective, which is a little stronger. And there are kind of like two variations of this. The first is the Ravid. The Ravid says, Nashim chayavim b'birkat hamazon dvar Torah. So he actually thinks that women and men are equally obligated. The afal pichen, even so, ein mizamnin alehem, men and women cannot combine to form a Zimmun. Lefi she'enan b'nei kviyut. Because women are not able to create kviyut, eating together, established in a chavura. This is interesting. On the one hand, we can say that they have motzi together, but what he seems to be saying is that for the purpose of Zimmun, you need a higher level of establishing that you've eaten together, to call it a fixed, established communal eating. And I would add that this might have some historical basis. I think I mentioned this last time, in that the kind of the historical sources about how they used to eat when there was reclining was that the women wouldn't recline. And if reclining was a sign of establishing the meal along with someone else, so the fact that for the most part women weren't reclining might mean that they weren't eligible for kviyut. Basically, Ravad doesn't think it's possible for women and men to create the conditions under which there would be an eligibility for Zimmun, because he doesn't think halacha will recognize their eating together as integrated on the level required to make a Zimmun together. Now, there's another view, and this is inspired by something that's said about women and bondsmen. Nashim v'avadim im ratzu lezamen ein mizamnin. If women and bondsmen want to combine to form a Zimmun, they can't. Why not, says the Gemara, Amailo, mishum pritzuta. It's considered immodest. Now, why is it immodest? So here's where the interesting question comes up. It might be that the issue here is specific to the bondsman. In other words, the bondsmen were not regarded necessarily too highly. They are not on the same level as the freemen. So if that's the case, then maybe there's more suspicion regarding their appropriate behavior. And therefore, there's more of a concern about putting women and these bondsmen in a ritual position together. One could argue that a freeman is different. One could argue that a regular male Jew isn't subject to the same level of concern about modesty, or not. The alternative is to say, no, concerns about men and women eating together, where, eating together, we talked about this a little bit, remember, at the end of our Mechitza series, right? There are some of the views about men and women mixing are particularly stringent when it comes to eating together because there's something festive and relaxed and often alcohol infused about eating. Maybe this is saying that there's a modesty concern specific to men and women and not just the women and bondsmen. Now Rashi here says like this. He says, he says, yeah, it's not that they're eating together is not able to be established. It's that it's not suitable. It's a matter of immodesty. Okay? And he suggests what the problems could be. It could be men and women. It could be men and men. It could be bondsmen and children. There are all different ways in which there could be an issue with women and bondsmen. Now, Sefer HaMaorot takes us in the direction that's not very mainstream. Early Rishon takes us in the direction of saying, yeah, it's specifically avadim who are prutzim. It is specifically a problem of a bondsman, the immodesty problem. But Rabbeinu Yonah, who is a much more important Rishon, says no. Nashim v'avadim uktanim ein mezamnin alehem. Pirish Rashi, denashim einan mitzterfot mitoch kach lezimun afilu im ba'alehem mipnei she'ein chavratan na'eh. Rabbeinu Yonah goes really far. He says, even a woman and her husband, it's immodest for them to join together in Zimmun. So, and he attributes this view to Rashi, even though that's not explicitly in our text of Rashi. So again, we have two technical ideas about why women and men wouldn't be able to combine to create a Zimmun. Different texts, different levels of obligation. And now we have something that's a little bit harder to get our fingers on, either that women and men really can't form the level of community that halacha would recognize or need to be able to recognize in order to have a combined Zimmun, or that there's something inherently immodest. Again, we're going to run into the question of what's more immodest about this than women responding to a men's Zimmun and participating in that. We're going to have to answer that question. But first, just a little aside, which is that recently there's been a lot of discussion in Israel, in particular based on, connected to a comment by Pri Megadim Rav Yosef Ta'omim in the late 18th century. Rav Yosef Ta'omim suggested that that Rav Yehuda Cohen's position was referring specifically to a woman and her husband and her children, i.e. he was saying that there is a position that specifically within the family, a mixed Zimmun is okay. Now, Pri Megadim himself then brings the Lavush who disagrees and says, not okay, can't be done. But this idea has been floated, okay, that perhaps within the family, if the real concern of combining for Zimmun is tzniut, or pritzut, immodesty, then perhaps in a family, that concern wouldn't apply because we relate to tzniut differently within, certainly a nuclear family. Now, this view has not been widely accepted. I just want to show you, before I get back up to the more mainstream views, that, let me just find it, that Rav Eliezer Melamed actually recognizes this view as a possibility. It says, Yesh rishonim shekatavu, sheisha she krovat mishpacha mitzarefet legvarim lezimun, There are very early halachic authorities. Rishonim has said that a woman could combine with men of her family to make zimun. And according to their view, our sages made a distinction between close relatives and not. And people who want to rely on this view within the nuclear family are permitted to. But it's more suitable to do the other view. Also, Rav Baruch Gigi, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, has gone on record saying that it could be acceptable to have a mixed zimun within a family unit. But he's been very careful to say that this is not for everybody and that these things are very sensitive matters depending on time and place. But basically what happened is that there was a man named Yonatan Gershon who put out an article in a journal arguing that within the nuclear family, there should be allowed to be a combined zimun. And he got a number of responses. Some of the responses saying absolutely not, but Rav Eliezer Melamed basically saying it is a plausible position to rely on, and Rav Baruch Gigi saying that this is something that can be relied on. At the same time, you have big guns, like for example, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, it says, "Ein isha mitzarefet im shnei anashim v'berkat hazimun, afilu isha im ba'ala ubanea." No, they can't join within the family, even a woman and her husband and her sons. So this is something that we might see some movement on in our time. It's still not mainstream. There is a view out there that people might rely on to do this within their families, but it is not something that's been widely accepted so far. Okay, now getting back to this question of what really makes Zimmun different from a mixed Zimmun, different from women answering to the men's Zimmun and participating in it, or from Hamotzi. Let's start with the Ritva. Ritva says something really interesting. Zimun, shani atam deikat seruf rabah. Zimun is different because there's a higher level of combining. Sheyesh shinui bevirkat hamazon bishvilan losif birkat hazimun bishvilan. If you say that men and women can combine to form a zimun, you're basically saying that your ritual is being transformed through the fact that men and women are eating together. What the Ritva seems to be saying is men and women eating together in and of itself is not inherently immodest or problematic. Women responding to a men's zimun is not inherently immodest or problematic. But men and women basically coming together to create a ritual that would not occur except for them coming together, he does think is problematic. Again, he doesn't fully explain. And Chazon Ish gives us a little bit more of what to go on about what this is about. He talks about the nature of this. Nashim ve'avadim ein mezamnin alehem. Men don't recite zimun in combination or combine to form one. V'had nashim einam mitztarfot im anashim mishum she'ein chavurutan na'eh ve'einam nikba'in ze im ze l'chavura achat. First, he just quotes what we've seen before. Umihu nir'eh. And nevertheless, it seems to be birkat hamotzi yotzot bevirkat anashim. They can still have one motzi with the men. V'lo have kechisaron heseba shekol echad mevarech latzmo. And it's not like they don't have a fixed status as a chavura where everyone needs to make their own recitation of a motzi. Why? Dedavka lihishtatef bivracha bishvil achdutan ein raui. Because specifically to recite a bracha for their unity is not fitting. But it is considered enough of a chavura to have one amotzi. What's he saying? He's building on the Ritva or perhaps explaining the Ritva. The Ritva said, the problem is you're creating a ritual. The ritual is different now of Birkat HaMazon because of men and women combining. That's a step too far. And the Chazon Ish is saying, in this case it is, and it's different from a motzi, not just because it's only by dint of combining that there's this ritual, but because the subject of this ritual is eating together. It's not just that they're combining to form a ritual, they're combining to form a ritual that's about combining. And Rav Uziel takes this another step and he says, the whole message of Zimmun is really about saying that you're grateful for eating together. Habat hoda'ah miuchedet al etzem chevrato v'izamnuto imahem. He says this is a fundamental aspect of what Zimmun is about, and that is troubling to him. In other words, hamotzi is something you would say whether or not you're combining. There's nothing in the language of a motzi that refers in any way, shape, or form to the fact that you're coming together as a group. Eating together, you are a group. You are not ritually calling attention to being part of a group. Birkat HaMazon on its own is something you would say. Zimmun, to do it based on a combined Zimmun, on the theory that the issue is immodesty, is problematic because it's creating a ritual because, or enabling a ritual, specifically because the men and women are combining. The ritual itself is calling attention to their combination. And on some level, the ritual itself is celebrating and formalizing the fact that they're together. And that's like a bridge too far. It's one thing to say men and women can eat together. It's another thing to say we're going to have a ritual that's going to be about men and women davka eating together. When women join a men's Zimmun, their Zimmun would have happened without the women there as well. The language of the Zimmun reflects joy of the people in the Zimmun eating together as a core group. And then there are other participants. And it's not specifically celebrating specifically the men and the women combining together. So that's the argument that's made according to this view, which is not the only view, but it is a very prevalent view. Okay. Last little thing to talk about before we finish up here, Zimmun B'Shem. Zimmun B'Shem, saying Nevarech Elokeinu. Now I say it as if it's just that very simple thing of Nevarech Elokeinu. The truth is that there are many different versions of Zimmun B'Shem that are floated in the Gemara or already in the Mishnah based on just how many people are eating together, like gradations of how many different praises of God you could have. If you had a group of 100, that would be fundamentally different in that sense than a group of 10. But what's it really about? Well, the Mishnah in Megillah says, Ein mezamnin b'shem pachot me'asara. You don't recite God's name, Nevarech Elokeinu, in Zimmun with fewer than 10 participants. And this comes in the context of talking about a davar shebikdusha. So there's a tendency to think that Zimmun itself, the shame, would be a davar shebikdusha. The only thing that's a little tricky is that the Gemara in Megillah gives a different reason for why you need 10 to be able to recite Zimmun with God's name. Kevan debai lamemar Nevarech Elokeinu, because they need to say Nevarech Elokeinu, B'tzir me'asara lav orach ara. Fewer than 10, it's not derech eretz, it's not the way things are done. It's not appropriate to be saying God's name with fewer than 10. That doesn't sound quite like this is a davar shebikdusha. Okay, well, even if it's not a davar shebikdusha, you could argue that it acts like a davar shebikdusha. So that's like, for example, what Shita Mekubetzet says. He says, Zimmun ein davar shebikdushahu. It's like a davar shebikdusha, but it's not really the same thing. Mishnah Berurah says, no, it is a davar shebikdusha. Why is that relevant? Do the 10 people have to be men? In other words, what if you have 3 men and 7 women, or 9 men and 1 woman? Or how about this? What if you have 10 women? Can they say Zimmun B'Shem? If you say that Zimmun is a davar shebikdusha, it's pretty cut and dry because we understand, and this is going to be part of a matter of sanctity or sanctifying God's name. This is going to be part of what my colleague Ilana Sober-Elsafan Bezrat Hashem is going to be talking about in the next 2 weeks when she talks about minyan and tefillah b'tzibur. So I don't want to cut off too much of her discussion. But that's going to be understood as something that's going to require 10 men, a quorum of 10 men. If not, maybe there's room. So there's a Gemara that kind of opens up the door to discussing this in different ways. But the truth of the matter is that this Gemara a little bit is preempted by the discussion that we had already. The Gemara here compares 100 women to 2 men. And there are different ways of understanding it. Tosfot say, see, 100 women, no matter how many women there are, they can never be like a minyan. Whether it's for prayer, whether it's for Zimmun, women never get to say, should never say Zimmun b'shem. The Rosh says, this comparison winds up being rejected by the Gemara anyway. Doesn't matter. And Rashi leaves room that the comparison is with respect to obligation, but that maybe when it comes to making a quorum for Zimmun b'shem, it might be open to women. Even so, you'll remember in terms of what we've learned already, this problem with mixed Zimmun. Someone has their microphone on. I'm going to ask them to put it off just so that we can all hear each other. So thank you. Please, we'll have a question time, and I'm hoping we'll open mics then, but just to let me finish up, it would be appreciated. What's going on here is really only relevant if you think that, beyond a certain point, if you think that mixed Zimmun is a possibility. If you think that mixed Zimmun, as we've learned, if mixed Zimmun is off the table, then women are not going to be able to join to create a quorum of 10 with men, the same way that they wouldn't be able to join to create a quorum of 3 with men. Similar issues are going to arise. However, there's still the question of women on their own reciting it. And that's where you have kind of this, something that might be a little open-ended. Halacha l'maaseh, in practice, this is not accepted. The Rambam and then the Shulchan Aruch rules just like him. The Rambam says very clearly, Nashim avadim uktanim em mezamnin aleihem aval mezamnin latzmam. Women don't combine with men to create a zimun, but women can make their own. V'lo tehei chavura shel nashim v'avadim uktanim mipnei apritzut. Women, bondsmen, and minors shouldn't be combining with each other. Aval nashim mezamnot la'atzman o avadim la'atzman. And women can make their own, and bondsmen can make their own. But not with the name of God. So whether or not he considers it a davar shebikdusha, technically, or whether he considers it Zimmun b'shem to be something that behaves like a davar shebikdusha, in any case, Rambam is saying a group of 10 women can't do it. There is a view that's mentioned again by this somewhat obscure Rishon Sefer HaMaorot. There is a view that he mentions that perhaps women could be able to do it as a 10. And he says that he says, I wouldn't protest if a group of 10 women were to recite Zimmun b'shem. Because the Gemara itself doesn't rule it out. There are ways to read the Gemara, as we discussed briefly, that are consistent with that. Even so, this is not halacha l'maisa, and it's not done. Okay, so let's just summarize, and we'll take some questions. What have we seen? In the past few weeks, we've talked a lot about what Zimmun is, what Birkat HaMazon is. And last week in particular, we focused on the question of women reciting Zimmun. This week, and we saw that both that women can and perhaps must, according to some views, and are encouraged, according to many views, to recite independent Zimmun. We also saw that women, according to many views, and this is mainstream halacha, are obligated to participate in Zimmun when there are 3 men at the table. Today, we kind of expanded our discussion. We talked a little bit about the text of Zimmun, where what we found was that the text is probably a lot more flexible than people have in mind, even though it has become very regimented to people. So to honor tradition, that Zimmun card that we made for Deracha is a very reasonable way to help people feel comfortable and recite a Zimmun that's appropriate for a group of women, and to also it comes as close as possible to what they've typically said in Zimmun. And at the same time, fundamentally, it's really flexible until you get to the words Nevarech. Following our discussion of the text, we looked at the possibility of a mixed Zimmun, and we saw that there's 3 main positions on that of why it wouldn't work. The why it wouldn't work either being a difference in the text recited by men and women, the why it wouldn't work, perhaps a difference in the level of obligation in Birkat HaMazon, the why it wouldn't work possibly being an issue of modesty or immodesty. And if it's an issue of immodesty, it might be specifically more problematic than women joining or participating in a men's Zimmun, or than men and women having one person recite Hamotzi for the entire group, because Zimmun is on some level calling attention to and really celebrating and formalizing ritually the eating together of the people who combine to create it, okay, which might be more sensitive. But that's not the only view. We also saw that according to that view, there are some minority voices which might be growing, that within a nuclear family, there might be room for a combined Zimmun if the issue is really modesty, because that's a context in which modesty is perhaps less at play. And we finished with a very quick look at Zimmun B'Shem, Zimmun invoking God's name, which may be a Davar Shebikdusha, or may simply be something that acts like a Davar Shebikdusha. On either account, it's widely accepted lahalacha that women, a group of 10 women eating together, cannot recite Zimmun B'Shem, though if women eat with a group of 10 men, there's also would be a question there of the woman breaking off, because again, just as a woman would become obligated in a regular Zimmun, eating with a group of 3 men, a woman would become obligated in Zimmun B'Shem, eating with a group of 3 men. Eating with a group of 10 men, which would make breaking off much more complicated. Okay, and with that, let's take some questions. Thanks everyone for your patience.
Okay, thank you. I guess that means I'm on again, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to start with the heavy duty questions.
Okay.
Feminism questions, the meta halakha questions. Why are the poskim so afraid? I guess on this issue, women don't do it, and that's of course a very broad question. And I don't know if you're interested on a sociological issue, a halakhic issue, or.
Well, look, I mean, I think so. This is really going back more to what we talked about last week, and it's not all poskim, but there's a concern about what is keeping us consistent with what's been done in the past, which is obviously a very important part of our commitment to tradition. And it seems like women and men is one of these issues that's become a hallmark of feeling safely like we're consistent with the past for a lot of people. And that's something that's being challenged, and that can create a lot of challenges. I mean, at the same time, it's not a crazy thing. It's the sense of, would this be, there was a guy who, I think it was Michael Pollan, he wrote about food, and he was trying to formulate rules about food. And he came up with like different rules, like eat mostly plants, et cetera, et cetera. The first rule was something like eat food, which doesn't seem like it's explaining much. And then he said, what I mean when I say eat food is eat food that my great-grandparents would have recognized as food, right? As opposed to some of the kind of more interesting concoctions that sometimes wind up on our processed concoctions on our tables. And I think there's something kind of similar going on here. Like there's kind of this intuitive sense of like, well, if my great-grandfather would walk in on this ritual, would he still recognize it as authentically continuing his tradition? And frankly, would my bubby recognize it as authentically continuing her tradition, right? So I think that's it's something that can be respected. There are cases where, let's say, like with combining to make a Zimmun, where it's strongly supported in the sources, so that it's harder to make an argument that it should be allowed, especially in light of these concerns. But then there are cases like, women making their own Zimmun, where it's downright difficult to understand why that should stop women from fulfilling a mitzvah, which is quite possibly even an obligation. Okay, let's move forward.
Okay, am I allowed to add my 2 cents worth?
Go for it.
Okay, I mean, what you say is all true, but it doesn't. There's so many things our grandmothers, even our mothers, wouldn't recognize about how the changes in the Jewish world. And the broader question is, why do the issues particularly pertaining to women, like the fact that a rabbi gets up and speaks English, and when he gives, in America, let's say, and the fact that he has a sermon would be enough to get you in cherem in Hungary. And, so it's just interesting. And it's really a much broader question, sociological question, but there clearly is no doubt in my mind that women's issue are the fault line that's the fault. It's no longer Zionism's, and it's not even, maybe in certain circles, it's not college education anymore. The issues that when I was a kid, or even before, that really defined the difference Israel, it's a non-issue. You don't really have people against the state of Israel, like who are like it's not, or so it's why women, and I guess it's hard. It's hard. For 2,000 years we've been doing something. That's why the partnership minyanim gets so much pushback, whereas women learning Gemara, which is arguably more of a halachic problem. One could easily make the argument that women learning Gemara is a greater halachic challenge than I'm not saying we have to. Anyways, that's enough.
I don't think I'd go there, but I think there is something about like what's readily visible that I think is part of that issue. Like there's it's readily a woman, meaning this is part of what's a challenge. When a rabbi is giving a sermon, it's still kind of like, at first glance, until you actually pay attention, it's still what's been going on. It jumps out at you.
But they didn't say that in Hungary. Trust me, believe me.
I think there's something about women's looking at. I mean, we've seen that with the politicization of women's photographs, right, and images. There's something about, no, I'm not talking about just traditional values of tznius. I'm just saying there's something about within the ritual that seeing or hearing women participate is jumping out at people in a way that other changes don't necessarily jump out at them. And that I think it's a factor. It's not the only factor. I think you're right, Rabbi Jay. Basically, one of the reasons why I'm teaching this and I'm studying this and I still have loads to learn about all these topics, always learning new things, is because I would really like women's obligations and mitzvot and participation in the world of Torah not to be a fault line. Meaning, I don't think that's where we should be. It could be a point of disagreement. Like there are a lot of points of disagreement, but I don't think it's good for our community for it to be a fault line. And I think the more we learn about it, maybe we can move in that direction.
Excellent. I agree with everything you said too, but thank you. Yes, very well put, and it's true. Okay. A simpler question, I think. What about a woman saying hamotzi for men?
So that's actually interesting. Years ago, I actually, I'll tell you a story. I mean, if people have patience. It's a good story though. I was we were living in Gross, and Rav Lichtenstein's Zatzal used to give a hashkafa shiur once a week. So there's one week that in those days, my husband and I grew up with my mother saying hamotzi. I didn't know that there was anything to talk about. Meaning I just wasn't aware. So anyway, so we were in Grus, which is a kollel of YU, and we had a bacher over for Shabbos dinner, which is one of the things that the young couples do. And my husband made kiddush, and I made a motzi. And the next week at Rav Lichtenstein's hashkafa shiur, the bacher, who nowadays is a good friend of ours, but the bacher got up and he said, "Rav Lichtenstein, what do you think of women making a motzi?" In my presence, I was right there. And then I was assuming, but what was interesting is I was assuming that again, I really had no concept that this would be an issue. I just didn't know. I was assuming that Rav Lichtenstein would get up and he would say, not an issue. And that's not what he said. He got up and he said, look, it's technically not an issue, but for generations, the Jewish man has been making kiddush, and he's gone on to say hamotzi, and why should we deviate from that? Shouldn't we value how things have been done? I guess it does relate to what we were talking about. And I didn't really know what to make of that, I'll be honest, at the time. Given that he was like the posek for the kollel, I decided that I wasn't going to, when we had guests over, I wasn't going to make a motzi because I didn't want to be seen as going against what he had said. Over the years, it's been interesting, especially because, like, for example, I make challah every week. So I feel very connected to the challah that's at our table. My husband and I do really feel, or the way that we experience our home is that it's really a joint home. In a sense, I am a ba'alat habayit and he is a baal habayit. So there's a way in which, my making a motzi would be a very natural thing. I'll talk on a personal level, I didn't get back to doing it after I left the kollel. And there was something about it having become, this is back to why are things a fault line, right? There was something about it having become an issue that people would talk about or argue about that just that kind of pushed me away from it. I'm not saying I'll never go back to it. I was actually talking about this today with Ravik from Yeshivat Har Tzion, because someone actually just asked us about it on our site, derech.org. We're going to be putting something up soon. And he was saying, yeah, it's not a technical problem. Maybe it's a matter of minhag. It's not a real issue. The halacha is balabayit botzeya. The person who's supposed to be breaking the bread and making a motzi is the head of the household. But the head of the household is, doesn't necessarily have to be a narrow definition, and the head of the household has the right to delegate things to others in any case. So if the people who are heading the household, if neither of them, certainly if the husband doesn't have an issue with it, it's hard to see why it would be halachically not okay. There are discussions within the world of halacha discouraging women from discharging men's obligations in various mitzvot. For different reasons. And that doesn't come up specifically with hamotzi at all. Maybe it just was assumed that it wouldn't be done. But, it's not the kind of thing that I would go along as a kind of evangelist and saying, all women need to make a motzi. And like I said, right now I'm not doing it. And at the same time, I think it's actually something that for a lot of couples potentially could make a lot of sense in the sense that whereas I think Kiddush, and again, you could make a halachic argument for the woman to make Kiddush as well. Maybe that should be another share. Where it comes to Kiddush, I think Rav Lichtenstein's point about the minhag being very strong, that the husband makes Kiddush, I do see that as being very firmly ingrained, or more firmly ingrained. But and even there, I think there's room for discussion in some cases. But but hamotzi, it seems much less so, and it seems that especially in the case, not always, but in the frequent case where the woman is really the one who's created the meal, that it could be a very positive opportunity to for her to kind of lead a ritual expression at the table. I guess what I would hope would happen with this is not specifically that every woman would do it or that no women would do it. I think what I would want, getting back to my story, and that might not be possible, and I think in different communities it's more sensitive. I would want us to be able to get to a place where that's not an issue, where the things that we're making an issue about are things that are something like, let's combining for Zimmun. So that's really something where there's a lot of there's solid halachic opposition to that. But hamotzi should be something that a woman has to think twice before she's leading it for her family. When if she has little kids, half the time she's leading them in it most of the meals of the week. I'm hoping that we don't get that we don't have to be in a situation where that's a real issue for people. I think we have other things to worry about, but
Very well said. I'll add, just to tell how much is context in place. I remember years ago, somebody was in, I believe, University of Chicago, but I don't remember exactly, told me that they were having a meal Hillel, Orthodox conservative reform, getting, hundreds of Jewish kids on a Friday night. So always, what are you going to do? And so they, the Orthodox always insist, everybody else has to compromise usually more. So they, okay, we'll all come to a mechitza minyan. But the conservative or whatever, the reform, not sure, both asked that, okay, we want a woman to make Kiddush. There are going to be hundreds of kids. So they didn't know what to do. It was, I guess, in Chicago, they asked Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, and Rav Aaron Soloveitchik said, listen, al pi halacha, of course a woman can say Kiddush for a man. There's absolutely no question about that. A woman, of course, can say Kiddush. On the other hand, for 2,000 years, that's not the practice. And the Gemara has some not nice things to say occasionally, perhaps, about that. But so, you don't do it. On the other hand, to promote, unity and that, Jewish kids who go to college can come together for a Friday meal, you should allow the woman to say Kiddush. So I think a lot of it is, I think that's also a beautiful answer. And a lot of it really depends. And I mean, I had also the zchut to be a student of Rav Lichtenstein for a year, and Rav Lichtenstein was, very traditional, conservative in many ways. And I'm not even sure that, his view might change, 25 years later. And I know Rav Moshe doesn't agree with everything his father did, and Rav Lichtenstein didn't agree with everything Rav Soloveitchik said. I guess one very interesting example is Rav Soloveitchik said not to change Nachim. You know, Ha'irha Ve'la, Habizuya, Believe Baneha. And Rav Soloveitchik, very small c conservative in these things. Rav Soloveitchik says we have no right to change the tefillah. There's no Beit HaMikdash. It's halachically bizuya. It's halachically empty. Who cares? And Rav Lichtin said, I can't follow that. I'm sorry. There's 700,000 Jews living in Yerushalayim. I can't say those words. So these things are very complex. And like you say, the most important thing is that it shouldn't be an issue. Everybody should do what they feel is right with themselves, or they're consulting with their rabbinic people and communities and whatever. But
it's not so much just that everyone should feel what they do is right, but it's just sort of like there are issues and there are things that aren't really issues, and it's important to be able to distinguish what they are.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. There's no bottom line here, Zev. Can a man eating with his wife an adult bench with a Zimmun? I don't think there's a bottom line, but
look, if your posek is Rav Baruch Gigi, or your posek is Rav Eliezer Melamed, then you know. And again, Rav Melamed wasn't exactly a cheerleader for this, but he honestly puts on the table there's an opinion. If those are poskim that you follow on other issues, then it's a reasonable thing to follow. If they're not your poskim, then it's a little harder because it's not widely received, but it's something that it's not how would I put it? This is not something that people, I think it's increasingly something that people would not protest, if that makes some sense. Like it's still not something it's not something that's widely done, but it's increasingly something that would not be met with protest. And then there's some corners, Rav Gigi really came out and he said he thinks it's okay. Rav Lamed said it's okay, but I prefer you not to do it. Rav Gigi said, I think it's okay. Okay, if it's not right for your community, fine. But I think it's okay. That's something different. The only thing about it is that for that to work, you really have to embrace the view that the core issue of men and women combining to form a Zimmun is that whole modesty path of understanding the issue, which is of course a legitimate point of view. But I think the difference of obligation perspective is reasonably persuasive. So I think that is just one thing, to think about. Like that works according to one understanding, which is a very prevalent understanding. It's not the only one. It doesn't work according to all the understandings of it.
Ellen raises a very interesting point. If you have a single woman who's hosting men and women at her meal, you were talking Mary, it would seem to be that the woman is obligated to say hamotzi. Balabait botseya, how could she give it to a guest to say hamotzi?
Look, a balabait can choose to give it to a guest, right? Especially if the guest is gadol mimenu or something like that. But yes, it would seem that that's really the appropriate. That would be more appropriate in that case. Now, of course, one could say, well, why is the single girl hosting a mixed meal, right? You can make trouble about all kinds of things, right? But at the end of the day, if the single girl is hosting a mixed meal and it's in her home, then yeah, it would certainly seem like the stronger case could be. I'll give you another scenario.
Does a widow feel better to you than a single girl? Does the word widow help?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's not just widow, there's also divorcees, right? There's a lot of people who find themselves being single and hosting. I was actually about to say, a woman is at home with her kids. Not everyone has kids, but a woman's at home with her kids. Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate that. A woman is at home with her. I would add, though, just in fairness, that was the question that was asked, was about a single woman. But you're right, you could describe single women in different ways. But anyway, a woman is at home, let's say with her kids. So she has a teenage boy. Her husband's not there, or she doesn't have a husband. She has a teenage boy. And she has, and the rest of the family. Who makes hamotzi? So what's interesting is I think a lot of people would instinctively give the motzi over to the teenage boy to say. And it's not so clear that that's what you should really do, right? She's the balat habayit and he's not. And that's, you can make a pretty good case for, it should be her. You might make a case that should be him from some element of chinuch or what have you, education. But really, there's a lot to be said for there's a lot to be said for the woman to do it on her own. And I think also, I think actually what you're really getting at, which is a broader question, is just considering we talked briefly about Baal Habayit and Baalat Habayit in benching. Just, you know, the assumption, which is a nice assumption, that you have like a normative Jewish family and it's the husband and the wife and they're all living together, is, you know, gonna run through or beneath a lot of halachot. But I think you're right that we have to increasingly think about or consider with seriousness the variety of different constellations people live in, and how that can affect even little things like ritual. And again, what's so interesting is like, even like, so why would we even ask the question? And that gets back to where we started, right? Because somehow it feels different for the woman to make a motzi, maybe somehow, and there's a hesitation, right? Maybe she hesitates when she has the male guests at the table. Because the thing that jumps out to our eye is not, oh, this is the hostess, but somehow, oh, this is the female. And maybe that's, you know, it might speak to some of the same, you know, some of the same issues. Why isn't it obvious?
It's probably more sociological than halachic, though. I would argue that's sociological fear, not halachic.
Probably. I mean, look, there's an interesting, I'm trying to remember, I think I saw a tshuva someone wrote about when there's a widow, maybe it was in Rav Aviner. Let's say you have a widow, and she's and people eat over her house and they're benching. So in that case, should you really say Birshut Baalat Habayit is like almost a matter of really needing to say it? Again, that would rely on viewing the term Birshut as really being about formally asking halachic permission, which is not so clear. No, I don't think it was there. I don't think it was Rav Aviner. It might have been Shut Mara Bazak, like Eretz Chamda. But there's like, you know, there's that interesting element there, which is like, oh, right, if a widow is leading the table, if she's hosting, or a divorcee, a woman, whatever her situation is the host, and there's no one else there who's the host, she's the one who decides who leads Zimmun when there's a Zimmun. That is in her authority to decide, and that's something that should be recognized. So that might be a good note to end on.